She lost everything in one night: her husband, her honor, even the name she'd carried for 10 years. But instead of giving up, she disappeared. And 6 months later, when she walked back into that room, no one recognized her. Not because she'd changed her appearance, but because beside her was the man all of Miami feared to even mention. This is the story of a woman who didn't choose revenge. She chose something far more terrifying. Please comment with the city you're watching from so I know how far this story has progressed. And watch until the end, because the ending will leave you breathless. The night Evelina Royce signed the divorce papers, she didn't cry. That was the part nobody understood. Not the attorney who slid the documents across the mahogany desk with the careful, rehearsed neutrality of a man who had witnessed too many endings to be moved by them. Not the paralegal sitting in the corner who kept glancing at Evelina with something between pity and fascination, as though she expected the elegant woman in the ivory blouse to shatter into something more satisfying. And certainly not Grayson Vale, who stood near the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Brickell Bay, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, at that particular angle he always used when he had already decided how a situation would end before it began. He had expected tears, maybe even begging. Evelina knew that. She had known it from the moment she walked into the room and saw the slight flicker of anticipation behind his eyes, that small, ugly thing that powerful men carry when they've grown too accustomed to watching people collapse beneath the weight of their decisions. She didn't give him that. She picked up the pen. She signed her name with the same steady hand she used to sign charitable donation forms and catering contracts and the hundreds of other invisible tasks that had kept Grayson Vale's world running smoothly for a decade. And when she set the pen down, she looked up at him only once. Not with hatred, not with grief. With something far worse, the calm, unhurried gaze of a woman who had already begun calculating the distance between where she stood and where she intended to go. Grayson blinked first. The attorney cleared his throat. Papers were gathered. A check was passed across the desk. The settlement Grayson had structured to look generous while costing him as little real discomfort as possible. Evelina looked at the check for exactly 2 seconds, folded it once, and slipped it into her clutch without comment. She walked out of this building into the thick Miami evening, into the salt-heavy air and the noise of the city that had watched her rise and had now, with gleeful patience, been waiting to watch her fall. She did not fall. She got into a cab. She gave the driver the address of the hotel where she'd been staying for the past 3 weeks, ever since she'd packed 2 suitcases and left the Brickell penthouse without a word to the household staff. She sat in the back seat and watched the city blur past the windows, and she let herself feel for exactly the length of that cab ride, the full unfiltered weight of everything she had lost. Not the money, not the address, not the social calendar, or the charity board seats, or the invitations to events she had never actually wanted to attend. She mourned something smaller and more devastating than all of that. She mourned the version of herself that had believed love was enough to make a man see her clearly. By the time the cab stopped, she had finished mourning. She paid the driver, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and went upstairs to figure out what came next. What came next, it turned out, was Chicago in January. It wasn't a plan so much as a retreat. Evelina had grown up in Chicago before Miami had gotten its hooks into her, before Grayson's world had pulled her south and further south until she had almost forgotten what cold felt like. She still had an apartment there, technically. A small place in the West Loop that she'd held on to against Grayson's repeated suggestions that she sell it. One of the few decisions she'd ever made purely for herself, and one of the few he had never quite managed to argue her out of. She flew back on a Tuesday in late November carrying 2 bags and the settlement check she hadn't cashed yet. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving Miami. She didn't write a goodbye to the women in her social circle who would have called it dramatic, or to the ones who would have called it brave, or to the ones, and there were more of these than she'd ever admitted, who would have simply been relieved that her particular brand of quiet competence was no longer present to make their own performances look threadbare by comparison. She just left. The Chicago apartment smelled like dust and old wood and the memory of a person she had been before she had made herself into exactly what Grayson needed her to be. She opened the windows despite the cold. She bought groceries from the corner store and made coffee in a pot she found at the back of the cabinet, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time without doing anything at all. It took her almost 2 weeks to start feeling like herself again. She wasn't entirely sure who that self was. 10 years of careful self-editing will do that to a person. But she started small, sleeping when she was tired instead of when it was socially acceptable, eating what she wanted instead of what photographed well at fundraising dinners, walking through the city for hours with no agenda and no company, and no one watching to evaluate whether she was representing the Veil name with appropriate dignity. She started to breathe differently, deeper, slower, like something in her chest had unclenched. She got a job. Nothing that would have made sense to anyone who knew her from Miami. She started consulting part-time for a small private wealth management firm on Michigan Avenue, helping ultra-high net worth clients structure philanthropic portfolios. It was quiet work, detail-oriented. It required her to be exactly as sharp as she actually was, rather than exactly as manageable as Grayson had preferred. She was better at it than anyone she worked with expected, and she took a controlled, private satisfaction in that. She started working out. Not the polished, curated fitness routines of her Miami life, the personal trainer, the Pilates studio, the carefully timed morning runs along the bay that were as much performance as exercise. She found a boxing gym 7 blocks from her apartment, and she started going 3 evenings a week, and she was terrible at it at first, and she didn't care. There was something she needed from the physical recklessness of it, from the requirement to be present and reactive, and willing to take a hit rather than deflect it gracefully. She went home to her apartment after those evenings with bruised knuckles and sweat in her hair, and she felt, incrementally, more solid, more real. She did not date. She was not ready for that, and she knew it, and she had finally gotten to a point in her life where she was no longer willing to pretend she was ready for things she wasn't. She kept to herself. She read. She worked. She walked. She was, for the first time in a very long time, simply existing, without an audience, without a role, without anyone else's narrative shaping the edges of her own. And then, on a Thursday night in January, everything changed. She had been at a hotel bar on the Magnificent Mile, waiting to meet a client for a late working dinner. The client, a hedge fund manager with a habit of running 40 minutes behind schedule and a complete lack of awareness that this was a problem, had texted to push their meeting back, and Evelina had ordered a glass of wine and settled into a corner seat with her laptop and the kind of focused patience that comes from years of waiting for men who believed their time was more valuable than yours. The assassination attempt happened at 9:47 p.m. She heard the cars first, 3 of them, moving too fast down the snow-covered street outside the hotel's revolving doors. Engines over-revved in a way that sounded wrong, even through the glass and the ambient noise of the bar. Then the shots. Later, she would think about the specific quality of the silence that followed the first burst of gunfire. That stunned, compressed half-second before the bar erupted into screaming and overturned chairs and the particular chaos of a crowd that doesn't know which way to run. She would think about the way her body had moved before her mind had finished processing what was happening. The old instinct from years of Grayson's corporate world: when crisis arrives, you don't freeze, you act, you manage. She had been near the entrance when it started. She dropped behind the marble bar top, and then, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she saw him. A man had been thrown from one of the vehicles, or had thrown himself, she couldn't tell, and was moving along the building's exterior wall, one hand pressed against his side, leaving dark smears against the pale stone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit that had been expensive before someone had put at least one bullet through the lower left side of it. He was moving with the controlled, purposeful economy of someone who had been trained to function through pain, but he was losing ground. She could see it in the slight drag of his left foot, in the way his breath was coming out in visible white bursts that were too rapid, too shallow. 3 men with guns came around the corner of the adjacent building. Evelina didn't think about it. That was the truth she would return to later. There was no calculation, no weighing of risk, no internal debate. She shoved the hotel's side door open, grabbed the wounded man by the arm, and pulled. He was heavier than she expected. Much heavier. He resisted for exactly 1 second, a full-body flinch of instinct, like an animal that's been hurt enough times that even help registers as threat. And then his eyes found hers and something shifted, some rapid internal assessment she could feel rather than see, and he let her move him. She dragged him behind a concrete support pillar near the loading bay entrance as the 3 men came around the corner. More gunfire. Something hit the wall above them and showered them with powdered concrete. She pulled the man further, around the corner of the loading bay, behind a massive steel delivery container, and they hit the ground together in the narrow, frozen gap between the container and the wall. His breathing was ragged. She pressed her hand against his side where he was holding his, felt the soaked fabric, the heat of blood in the cold air. "How bad?" she said. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were gray, a particular shade of gray that was almost colorless, like February ice over deep water. He had a wide jaw and a scar that ran along his left cheekbone, and a face that had been handsome once, and had been through enough that it had moved beyond handsome into something harder and more interesting and considerably more frightening. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said. His voice was low, controlled, despite everything. "That's not what I asked." A beat. Outside the loading bay, she could hear shouting, running feet, then sirens beginning in the distance. Someone had called the police, or his people had, or both. "Through and through," he said. "Ribs, not the lung." "You sure about that?" "I've had worse." She believed him, which should have frightened her more than it did. She kept her hand on the wound. Her white blouse was ruined. She didn't care. She watched the corner of the wall where the three men would appear if they'd tracked their movement, and she was aware of her own heartbeat, fast but steady, not panicked. And she was aware that the man beside her was watching her with the same measuring attention she was giving the corner, and that this mutual assessment felt, absurdly, like the most honest thing that had happened to her in years. The three men didn't come around the corner. Later, she'd find out that two of them had been intercepted by the advanced security detail who'd been positioned a block away. The third had run. When the sirens got close, the man beside her reached into his jacket. Careful, deliberate movements, she noticed, nothing sudden, and produced a phone. He made a call in Italian, 3 sentences, completely calm, despite the blood soaking through to her hand. He listened. He ended the call. He looked at her again. "My people will be here in 4 minutes," he said. "When they arrive, I would recommend that you—" "I'm not leaving," she said. He stopped. "You don't know who I am," he said. "No," she agreed, "but you're bleeding on my coat, and I'm not squeamish, and 4 minutes is 4 minutes." Something moved across his face. It was a small thing, a compression at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the muscular memory of one. Like a man who had stopped finding things genuinely surprising a long time ago and had just encountered something that came close. "No," he said. "I don't suppose 4 minutes is anything." They stayed like that, Evelina's hand against his side, both of them watching the shadows, until 2 black SUVs came around the corner of the loading bay with their headlights off, and 4 men spilled out, moving with the coordinated, unhurried efficiency of people who did this regularly. One of them, a heavy-set man with close-cropped hair and the flat, scanning eyes of a career professional, came directly to the wounded man and crouched down, and the way he moved told Evelina everything about the hierarchy of the situation. "Cassian," the man said. Low. Urgent. So that was his name. She filed it away. Quote, "They tried to get her to leave, politely, but unmistakably. One of the security men had approached her with a folded card and a look that was professionally neutral in the specific way of men who have been paid well to be professionally neutral, and told her that Mr. Moretti's team appreciated her assistance and would ensure her bill for the evening was taken care of, and that a car had been arranged to take her wherever she needed to go." Evelina looked at the card. She looked at the man. She looked past him at Cassian Moretti, who was being assisted into one of the SUVs by 2 of his people and who had turned his head, despite everything, to watch her. She looked back at the security man. "Tell him I said he's welcome," she said, "and tell him his suit is destroyed." She walked back into the hotel, asked the bar staff for a replacement blouse from the lost and found, and sent her client a message rescheduling their meeting for the following morning. She slept better that night than she had in 6 months. He called her 3 days later. She didn't know how he had gotten her number. She didn't ask. The call came at 7 in the evening while she was making dinner, pasta, something simple, the kind of meal she cooked for no one but herself and took a quiet pleasure in, and the number that appeared on her screen was not one she recognized. She answered it anyway. "You kept your hand on the wound for 4 minutes in below freezing temperatures," he said, without introduction. Most people would have run. Most people aren't paying attention, she said. She turned the burner to low. A pause. I'd like to buy you dinner, he said. To thank you. You don't need to thank me. No, he agreed. But I'd like to anyway. She thought about it. She was aware of what the smart decision was. She had spent the 3 days since that night looking up the name Cassian Moretti carefully from a device she was reasonably confident wasn't monitored, and what she had found had been substantial, troubling, and almost entirely unverifiable. The kind of information that circulates in the specific social strata where wealth and violence share real estate, where everyone knows and no one says. She was also aware that she had not once in those 3 days, felt afraid of him. All right, she said. The restaurant was a private room in an Italian place on the Gold Coast that didn't appear on any review platform and probably didn't need to. The food was extraordinary in the understated way of places that cook for people who have eaten everywhere and can no longer be impressed by spectacle. The wine was from a producer she recognized from a trip to Tuscany she'd taken in her early 20s, before Miami, before Grayson, before she had started curating her preferences to align with someone else's taste. Cassian Moretti looked different, cleaned up, and fully functional. He was wearing a charcoal suit, new, she noted, his tailor must have been fast, and the scar on his cheekbone was less visible in the warm lighting. He was sitting very still when she arrived, the kind of stillness that wasn't relaxation, but rather a very advanced form of controlled readiness. And he stood when she entered the room with a formality that surprised her, because it was genuine. You look better without the blood, he said. So do you, she said, and sat down. He asked her questions. Real ones. Not the social performance questions she had grown accustomed to in Miami, the ones designed to signal interest while collecting information for future leverage. He asked about the wealth management work, and when she explained it, he listened in a way that told her he already understood more about it than he was letting on, and she found that she didn't mind being seen through. It was a relief, actually, to be with someone who didn't require her to perform smaller than she was. At some point, mid-conversation, somewhere between the second course and the wine she'd barely touched, he said, without particular emphasis, I should tell you what I am. She looked at him steadily. I know what you are. His eyes settled on her face. And? And I came to dinner anyway. A longer pause this time. He turned his wine glass once, slowly, between his fingers. Most people, he said, are afraid of me. I noticed that. You're not. She thought about this honestly, because he seemed like a man who would notice if she was performing an answer rather than giving one. No, she said, but I think that's probably its own kind of problem. Something shifted in his face again. That same muscular memory, that almost smile, but deeper this time, reaching the gray eyes for just a fraction of a second before he reined it back. I am not a good man, he said. The directness of it was almost startling. Evelina picked up her wine. Beneath the table, she pressed one hand flat against her knee. A private gesture, invisible, a small act of steadying. She thought about 10 years of a man who had been relentlessly charming and fundamentally dishonest. She thought about the quiet, grinding work of loving someone who treated your clarity like an inconvenience. She looked at Cassian Moretti, this dangerous, complicated, deliberately truthful man, and she said calmly, I'm not looking for a savior anymore. The room was quiet. Outside, the city moved. Inside that private room, something irreversible began. Bod. She flew back to Miami 4 months later. She had been with Cassian, not easily, not without turbulence, not without nights when the reality of his world pressed against the walls of whatever they were building together, in ways that made her chest tight and her mind run cold calculations about risk and consequence, and the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. There were things she didn't ask about. There were things she did ask about, and received answers that were precise and deliberately incomplete, and she accepted that because at least they were honest incompleteness. The kind that said, I am protecting you from specifics rather than the kind that says, I am managing your perception of me. He taught her things. Not as lessons. He was not a man who taught by lecturing, but over 4 months of proximity and attention, she absorbed the way he read rooms, the way he sat with silence rather than filling it, the way he understood that power in its most durable form had almost nothing to do with noise. He also listened to her, in the particular way that tells you a person is tracking not just your words, but your reasoning, your history, the specific shape of your intelligence. Grayson had listened to her for years in the way a man listens when he's waiting for the part that's relevant to him. Cassian listened like she was the whole conversation. One evening in March, sitting on the balcony of his apartment with Lake Michigan flat and iron-colored below them, he said, "Grayson Vale's empire has begun showing structural weaknesses." She didn't look at him. "I know." "It would be easy," he said. A pause. "Wind off the lake." "I don't want it to be easy," she said. He glanced at her. "No?" She turned to look at him then, and whatever was in her face made him go very still. "I want to walk back into that city," she said, "on my feet, with my name, and I want everyone who watched him discard me to understand exactly how wrong they were." Cassian studied her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "And I want it to last," she said. "Whatever happens, I want it permanent." He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that she thought he might not respond, and she was already turning away when he said, very quietly, "Marry me." She stopped. She looked back at him. His face was composed. His hands were still. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had said something that frightened him and had decided to say it anyway. "That's not—" she started. "I know what it is," he said. "I know exactly what it is. And I know what I am, and I know what that makes me. And I know that if you say yes, your life will be complicated in ways that most people would run from." He held her gaze, unwavering. "But I also know that you don't run from complicated things. You run toward them with your hand pressed against the wound." She was quiet. The lake moved below them. "Give me 1 week," she said. He nodded. 1 week. She took 3 days. They married quietly. No announcement. No ceremony that would have functioned as a spectacle or a statement. That would come later, naturally, through presence rather than proclamation. A private ceremony in a judge's chambers, 2 witnesses, the simple exchange of rings, a black diamond that he had chosen because, he said with characteristic directness, it was rare and unyielding and did not require anyone's approval to be valuable. She put it on her finger. She looked at her reflection in the courthouse bathroom afterward, and she tried to find, in the woman looking back at her, the soft-edged person she had been in Miami, the one who had attended galas with a curated smile and defended a man who didn't deserve defending and made herself smaller and smaller and smaller until she fit neatly inside the story he wanted to be telling. She couldn't find her. What she found was someone else, someone who had been there all along, maybe, waiting underneath the performance, patient and quiet and considerably more dangerous than anyone had given her credit for. She dried her hands. She walked out. And 4 weeks later, Evelina Moretti flew back to Miami. The Black Orchid auction was the right event for a return. She had known that the moment Cassian mentioned it, one of the city's most exclusive underground charitable events, the kind that existed in the productive tension between philanthropy and spectacle, where powerful people competed to be seen giving money to causes they may or may not have actually cared about. She had attended it 3 times as Grayson Vale's wife. She had organized the seating chart for one of them. She knew the room. She knew the people in the room. She knew, and this was the part she had turned over quietly in her mind during the weeks of preparation, that she was walking back into a space where every person present had formed an opinion of her, and most of those opinions had been shaped by Grayson's version of events, and all of them were wrong. She had chosen the dress with deliberate care, silver black satin, floor length, constructed to move rather than constrain. Diamonds at her throat. Not Grayson's diamonds, which had been returned with everything else, but pieces she had acquired herself over the past months, chosen because she liked them, rather than because they photographed well at charity dinners. The black diamond ring on her left hand, her hair back, her face steady. Cassian had looked at her when she was ready and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're about to terrify everyone in that building." "Good," she said. He almost smiled. "Good," he agreed. The car was waiting. The city was hot and luminous outside the window as they moved through it, and Evelina sat with her hands in her lap and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation without dread. The pure, forward-leaning weight of a woman moving deliberately towards something she had chosen rather than away from something she feared. The obsidian black ballroom doors opened, and Evelina Moretti walked back into Miami. The silence that fell across the room was immediate and total, the kind that happens before the brain is finished telling the mouth what to say. She felt it, felt every eye, every recalibration, every rapid internal adjustment as people processed the sight of her, changed, composed, undeniably present, and beside her, one hand resting at the small of her back with the quiet authority of a man who had claimed a territory and was under no obligation to justify it to anyone: Cassian Moretti. She watched Grayson Vale across the ballroom, watched the moment he saw her, watched the glass in his hand slow and then stop moving, watched the color shift in his face, watched the man who had believed she was broken try and fail to reconcile the woman standing in that doorway with the woman he thought he had discarded. She didn't smile at him. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She let the room do it for her. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the composure and the diamonds and the years of work that had brought her to this exact moment, a door she had been holding closed for 6 months swung open just slightly, enough for her to feel the cold air behind it, the unfinished business, the reckoning that had not yet fully arrived. Grayson was moving toward her through the crowd. She kept her face still. She had waited 6 months for this. She could wait another 60 seconds. Grayson Vale moved through the crowd the way he always moved through crowds, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 20 years learning that space was something you claimed rather than waited for. People shifted without quite knowing why. Some reflex in them, trained by years of proximity to money and the particular social gravity of men who had a lot of it, opened a path before he reached it. He was good at that. Evelina had always known it, had once, in a different life, found something attractive in it. That forward momentum, that certainty, the way he entered a room like he owned the oxygen in it. She had been young enough then and bruised enough by other disappointments to mistake confidence for safety. She didn't make that mistake anymore. He stopped about 4 feet from her, close enough for conversation, far enough to assess. She recognized that too. The tactical pause, the beat where Grayson Vale gathered information before deciding which version of himself the situation required. He looked at the ring first. She had known he would. It took him 3 full seconds to pull his eyes back to her face, and in those 3 seconds she watched something move through him. Something fast and dark and badly hidden. A compound emotion that she would have spent years of her former life trying to soothe. She didn't move to soothe it. "Evelina," he said. His voice was smooth. It had always been smooth. That was one of the things about Grayson Vale. His voice never cracked, never went thin, never gave you the acoustic truth of what was happening behind it. She had believed for a long time that this meant he was steady. She understood now that it meant something else entirely. "Grayson," she said. Nothing more. She let the single word sit there between them, flat and complete, like a door shut quietly rather than slammed. His eyes moved, involuntarily, she could tell, the kind of flicker that happens before the practiced exterior catches up with the honest instinct. To Cassian, who was standing at Evelina's left and slightly behind her, one hand resting at the base of her spine. Not gripping, not possessive in the crude, visible way of men who need to broadcast their ownership. Just present, a point of contact that communicated to anyone paying attention everything it needed to. Cassian was looking at Grayson the way a man looks at something he has already assessed and categorized and found uninteresting, which was somehow worse than hostility. Grayson looked back at Evelina. "You look," he started. "Different," she said before he could finish. "You said that already, 6 months ago when you were looking for a cleaner word." A beat. His jaw moved. "I was going to say, well, I know what you were going to say." Around them, the ballroom had resumed its noise. Music from the quartet in the corner, the careful orchestrated clatter of an open bar, the layered hum of 200 people pretending they weren't watching the most interesting scene in the room. But there was a radius around the 3 of them that remained quieter than the rest, as though the ambient intelligence of the crowd had registered that something was happening and had adjusted accordingly. Grayson looked at Cassian again. This time he held it longer. an attempt at the kind of leveling, unimpressed stare that Grayson used in boardrooms when he wanted to establish dominance before a negotiation began. Cassian looked back at him with the gray, patient emptiness of a man who had looked at things considerably more threatening and remained unbothered. Grayson looked away first. He did it smoothly, turning back to Evelina as though it were a choice, but she had been watching, and she saw it, and the scene of it settled something in her chest that she hadn't known was still unsettled. "We should find somewhere to talk," Grayson said. "We are somewhere," she said. "We are talking. Somewhere private." No. The word was quiet and absolute. Grayson blinked, a rare tell on a face that he had spent decades learning to control. A small, involuntary compression of surprise, because she had never said no to him like that. Not flat, not cold, not without the qualifying softness of a woman who had been trained by years of loving him to make her refusals feel like apologies. "Evelina, we don't have private conversations anymore, Grayson." She held his gaze without effort. "You made that decision for both of us. I've moved on to arrangements that suit me better." He looked at the ring again. She let him look. "This is—" He stopped, recalibrated. When he spoke again, it was quieter, and she recognized the register, the one he used when he was genuinely unsettled, the intimate frequency, the voice he had used in the early years of their marriage when something had gotten past his defenses. "Eve, this isn't you." Something old stirred in her, faint, like a radio signal from a dead station. She let herself feel it for exactly a moment. The ghost of the woman who would have found comfort in that voice, who would have said, "Tell me who I am," then, who would have waited for his definition of her like it was an answer she couldn't supply herself. "You're right," she said. "It isn't who I was when I was with you." Cassian said nothing. He hadn't moved and hadn't spoken since Grayson arrived. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a current, not visible, not loud, but present in a way that changed the character of everything around it. Grayson's eyes cut to him. "This is a power play," he said, with a sudden hard edge she recognized too. The boardroom voice's angrier cousin, the one that came out when he had stopped trying to charm and started trying to intimidate. "Bringing him here, wearing that ring, this is theater." Cassian spoke for the first time. "If you believe that," he said, "you understand neither of us." His voice was low, not raised, not pointed, not theatrical. It had the quality of something that didn't need to try. Like a large stone dropped into still water that doesn't make noise so much as it simply displaces everything around it. Grayson stared at him. For a moment, the boardroom mask slipped further than he intended, and she could see it clearly. The fear, specific and physical, the body's honest answer to something the mind was trying to argue away. Then someone touched Grayson's elbow. His business partner, a silver-haired man named Fielding, who had been eyeing the cluster of them from 12 feet away for the past 3 minutes. Fielding leaned close and said something Evelina couldn't hear. Grayson's face reset. He straightened. "Enjoy your evening," he said. The smoothness was back, professional grade, the lacquer applied fast. He looked at Evelina one more time. "This conversation isn't finished." "Yes, it is," she said. He walked away. She watched him go without turning her body to track him, just her eyes, level and quiet, until he was absorbed back into the crowd. Then she exhaled slowly through her nose and let her shoulders settle and reach for the glass of champagne that a passing server had offered, taking one precise sip. Cassian's hand moved from her back to her elbow, brief, almost imperceptible, a question rather than a command. "I'm fine," she said, before he could ask it. "I know," he said. "Chigibosh." The problem with the evening started 40 minutes later and came from a direction Evelina hadn't anticipated, which was unusual and told her something about how thoroughly the past 6 months had rearranged her threat map. Her name was Vivienne Cortez. Vivienne had been one of Evelina's closest companions in her Miami years, or had occupied the social role of one, which she had spent a long time believing was the same thing. She was 40, beautiful in the particular maintained way of women in that world, married to a real estate developer who handled transactions that Evelina now understood, with the education Cassian's proximity had provided, probably benefited from being unexamined, She had been kind to Evelina during the divorce in the specific, visible, photographable way that certain women are kind during divorces, making sure the right people knew she had been kind, which meant the kindness was less about Evelina and more about Vivian's own narrative. She appeared at Evelina's elbow with a champagne glass and a smile that was warm and precise in equal measure. "Oh my God," she said. "Evelina." The embrace was perfunctory, but well executed. Vivian pulled back and held her at arm's length and did the full-body scan that women like her performed constantly and called compliments. "You look incredible," Vivian said. "I barely—" Her eyes found the ring, stopped. "Vivian," Evelina said, "it's good to see you. Is it true?" Vivian's voice had dropped to the register of performed confidentiality, the intimacy of a whisper that is calibrated to be partially audible. "Everyone is saying—" She glanced past Evelina to where Cassian was in conversation with a man Evelina recognized as the city commissioner. "Is that actually Cassian Moretti?" "Yes." "And you're—" Vivian's eyes dropped again to the ring. "Eve." "Vivian. You know what he is." Evelina looked at her steadily. "I know exactly what he is." "And you think that's—" She stopped herself. Recalibrated. The smile came back, carefully reinstalled. "Well, you look happy. That's what matters." "Is it?" Evelina said. There was no hostility in her voice. She wasn't angry, not at Vivian specifically, but she was no longer in the business of accepting social performances at face value, and she was no longer going to pretend otherwise. Or does what matter to you depend on what information you're going to be able to take back to whoever is most interested in having it? Vivian's smile stayed in place. It took effort. Evelina could see the effort. "That's not fair, Eve." "It's probably the most accurate thing I've said to you in 10 years, Evelina said pleasantly, "which is either a failure of my honesty or yours." Vivian's face went through several quick revisions. Then she laughed, a real one, shorter and less polished than her social laugh, and shook her head slightly. "Cassian Moretti has been terrible for your manners," she said. "Cassian Moretti has been very good for my honesty," Evelina said. Vivian left a few minutes later, gliding back into the crowd with her champagne and her smile and her information, and Evelina watched her go and felt something she identified after a moment as relief. The relief of a woman who had stopped performing friendships and was beginning to understand the spaciousness of that. Cassian found her near the balcony doors around 10 o'clock, where she had stepped out of the main current of the room to breathe. The night air off the harbor was thick and warm, Miami's version of cool, which was different from anywhere else's version, and the city lights reflected in the black water in long, fractured lines. He came to stand beside her without touching her. They stood like that for a moment. "Fielding," he said, "the man who pulled Vale away." "I know who he is. He made 3 calls in the last 20 minutes. She looked at him. "You're having him watched. I'm having the room watched. That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. But Fielding's calls went to 2 of Grayson's primary investors and to a man named Dario Rice, who is interesting to me for reasons that have nothing to do with your ex-husband. She turned to face him more fully. The harbor moved below them. Inside the ballroom, the auction was beginning. She could hear the auctioneer's practiced baritone starting the first lot, the ripple of bidding, the performance of charity. "Rice," she said. She searched her memory. "Real estate. Commercial development in the Port District." Cassian looked at her with the focused attention she had come to recognize as his version of approval. Not warm, exactly, but present and genuine, and entirely unperformative. "That's the surface. What's beneath it?" He considered how much to tell her. She recognized that too. The slight pause, the calibration. He did it less than he used to. She took that as its own kind of communication. "Reese has been moving money through port-adjacent properties for 2 years, Cassian said. "The money doesn't belong to Rice. I've been patient about it because patience is more productive than speed in these matters. But if he's in conversation with Grayson's people tonight, then Grayson's financial trouble isn't just structural," Evelina said. A beat. "No," Cassian said. "It isn't." She looked back at the harbor. Something was shifting in her understanding of the evening. The dimensions of it rearranging, the way a room looks different when you turn a light on and realize the furniture is arranged differently than you thought in the dark. He's in deeper than I knew, she said. Not a question. He always was, Cassian said. He simply borrowed from sources that were willing to be invisible while things were going well. And now? Now things are not going as well. She absorbed this. The harbor moved. Inside, a lot sold for something in the high six figures, and the room applauded with the crisp, appreciative sound of people who spend money as a form of self-expression. He came to this event tonight knowing you'd be here, she said. She was working it out as she spoke. He had to have known. Vivian, Fielding, half the people in that room, they would have told him. Yes. So he came anyway. Yes. Which means he's more desperate than he's showing. Cassian said nothing, which was its own answer. She pressed her hands flat against the balcony railing. The iron was warm from the day's heat, stored and releasing slowly into the night. She thought about Grayson Vale, not with the old grief, which had finished its work and left her, but with the new, colder clarity she had developed in its absence. She thought about a man who had built an empire on borrowed weight and borrowed money and borrowed confidence, who had spent a decade with the most capable person in his life and had never understood what he actually had. She thought about what Cassian had said 3 months ago on a different balcony overlooking different water. It would be easy. And her answer. She thought about what she wanted. I want to go back inside, she said. Cassian looked at her. I want to bid on something, she said. Something significant. A pause. Anything specific? She turned from the harbor. The Delacroix building. It's being auctioned as a development right tonight. I saw it in the catalog. Port adjacent. Rice has been the expected buyer for 6 months. She met his eyes. I want to buy it. Cassian was still for a moment. Then something moved in his face, something that was more than the almost smile, something she hadn't seen often, a quality of genuine and unguarded interest, like a chess player watching an unexpected move on a board he thought he had fully mapped. That will make Rice very unhappy, he said. I know. It will also make him dangerous. I know that too. He held her gaze for another moment. The city pushed its noise and light up around them from below. Then he straightened and adjusted his cuff and extended his arm. Then let's go inside, he said. The bidding on the Delacroix development rights started at $800,000 and moved quickly. Rice's proxy, a thin-shouldered man in a gray suit who had been stationed near the front of the room since the auction began, pushed it to $1.4 million in 3 efficient raises that communicated experience and predetermined authority. The room followed the trajectory with the casual, informed attention of people who understood the subtext. Rice was buying. Rice always bought the port-adjacent properties. This was already decided. Evelina raised her paddle. 1.6. The thin-shouldered man glanced back toward the part of the room where Rice was standing. A look passed between them. Rapid, tight, recalibrating. 1.7. She raised the paddle again. 1.9. She was aware of the attention shifting in the room, not all at once, but in waves. The ripple of recognition spreading outward from the people nearest her who could see her face, who could see whose hand was resting at the small of her back, who could do the math on what a counterbid from Evelina Moretti meant in terms of what it was actually a bid from. The thin-shouldered man raised again. 2.1. Evelina looked at Cassian, not for permission. They had moved well past the kind of relationship that required her to check, but because she wanted to see his face. He was looking at Rice across the room. Rice was a stocky man in his mid-50s with the kind of weathered, compact face that came from years of transactions in rooms that didn't appear in newspapers. He was looking back at Cassian with an expression that was doing a lot of work to remain neutral. She raised her paddle. 2.5. The thin-shouldered man did not counter. The auctioneer's voice moved through the standard cadence, going once, going twice, and in the silence between going twice and the hammer fall, Evelina heard, very clearly, the specific quality of a room that has understood that something has shifted and is waiting to find out how much. The hammer fell. She lowered her paddle. Around her, the room processed. Conversations restarted at a different frequency. She could see people leaning toward each other. The specific lean of people exchanging information they consider significant. She saw Vivian across the room, watching her with an expression that had moved past performed warmth into something more honest and less comfortable. She saw Fielding say something to Grayson with an urgency that Grayson's composed expression couldn't quite contain. She saw Rice. He was looking directly at her, not at Cassian, at her. And the look on his face was not the look of a man who had lost a bid at a charity auction. It was the look of a man who had just recategorized something, who had filed a piece of information in the folder that mattered most to him and had closed it and was thinking about next steps. Cassian's hand moved to her back again. "Don't look at him too long," he said, very quietly, for only her. She dropped her eyes to her paddle. She set it down on the table beside her with measured care. "He's going to come for me," she said, not alarmed, not asking, just stating. "Not tonight," Cassian said. But, he agreed. She nodded once. She picked up her champagne. She turned back to the room and the evening and the 100 other conversations that were happening and would happen before they left this building, and she held herself straight and still and present, exactly as she had trained herself to do. It was not until they were in the car afterward, the city moving past the windows, the harbor receding behind them, the night thick and salt damp and ordinary, that she felt the first real pressure of what she had done. Not regret. That wasn't what it was. It was the feeling of a door that only opens one way clicking shut behind her, the point past which the path behind you no longer exists. She had known it was there, had walked toward it deliberately, had chosen to step through it with open eyes. But knowing a thing and feeling it are different weights. She was quiet for a long stretch of road. Cassian didn't fill the silence. She had come to understand that this was something she loved about him, not found tolerable, not appreciated intellectually, but actually loved, the way you love the specific gravity of a person who lets you take up space. "Rice," she said eventually. "Yes. He's going to find out how far back we go, you and I. He's going to build a timeline. He already has." She turned to look at him in the passing light of the city. "And Grayson?" A pause. When Cassian answered, his voice was even. "Careful. More careful than she was used to from him, which told her the answer was layered. Grayson Vale reached out to Rice 6 weeks ago," he said. The car moved. She felt the information land in her body, not in her chest, not with grief, not with the old heat of betrayal. Lower than that. Colder. In the place where a woman keeps the things she cannot afford to feel in real time and has to file away for later examination. "He knew," she said. "He suspected," Cassian said. "Now he knows." "What did he offer Rice?" Another pause, longer. "That," Cassian said, "is what I need to find out." She looked out the window. The city moved past, indifferent and lit and relentless, full of people making decisions that would matter and decisions that wouldn't, and most of them unable to tell the difference in the moment. She thought about Grayson and Rice and 6 weeks of conversations she hadn't known were happening. She thought about the specific, patient way Cassian had moved through this entire evening, the assessment, the auction, his eyes on Rice across the room. She thought about a man who had been in this business for 20 years and who did not make decisions in real time if he could avoid it. "You knew," she said. "You knew about Grayson and Rice before tonight." Cassian said nothing. "You brought me here knowing Rice would be here, knowing Grayson had been in contact with him, knowing the Delacroix property would be available." Still nothing. "Cassian." He looked at her then. His face in the shifting light of the city was still and undefended, which was its own kind of answer. Not evasive, not performing ignorance, but not rushing to explain either. Holding the space between what he knew and what she needed to understand and letting her bridge it. "How much of tonight," she said carefully, "was my idea?" The car stopped at a light. Outside, 2 people were arguing on the corner. Something about a cab, she thought. Nothing. The ordinary friction of a city at midnight. "The dress," he said, "was entirely yours." She looked at him. "The ring," he said, "was mine." "And the rest?" He held her gaze. "Some of both. In proportions I'd discuss with you anywhere except in this car in traffic in Miami." She thought about that. The light changed. The car moved. She should have been angry. Part of her was. But there was another part. The part that had pressed her hand against a wound in freezing temperatures without being asked. The part that had looked at an honest monster and said, "I'm not looking for a savior." And that part was running the calculation and arriving at something more complicated than anger. He had moved her into position like a piece he needed on the board. He had also put her on the board in the first place because he believed she could handle it. Those two things were not the same. They were also not entirely separate. "When we get home," she said, "you're going to tell me everything about Rice, everything about Grayson, everything about what the next move is and what it costs and who pays it." "Yes," he said, "and if I think you've miscalculated, I'll want to know." "Not want," she said. "Need." A beat. He nodded. "Need." She looked out the window again. The harbor caught the light in her peripheral vision, briefly visible between buildings. Gone. She thought about Rice's eyes across the auction floor, the recategorization, the folder closing. She thought about Grayson, somewhere behind them in the lit ballroom, understanding tonight only enough to misread it, which was worse than not understanding at all, because misreading something dangerous in a specific direction could make a frightened man do unpredictable things. She thought about the door behind her, the one-way door, the specific permanent quality of the last 6 hours. There was a name for this moment, she thought. The military had one. The point of no return. The threshold past which the fuel calculation changes, past which you can no longer reverse course and land where you started, past which the only option that makes physical sense is forward. She had crossed it tonight. She had known she was crossing it. What she hadn't known, what Cassian had either miscalculated or deliberately withheld, and she wasn't yet certain which, was how fast the other side of that threshold would come rushing up to meet her. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. 6 words. She read them twice. Then she locked the screen and set the phone face down on her knee and looked straight ahead at the road unspooling in the headlights and said nothing for a long time. Cassian, beside her, waited. Finally, she turned the phone over and held it out to him. He read it. His face went very still. The city moved past them. The night moved past them. Somewhere behind them in the lit ballroom, something was already beginning that neither of them could now stop, only shape. And shaping it would cost things neither of them had finished counting. She took the phone back. She looked at the 6 words one more time. "I know what you did in Chicago." Cassian held the phone for 11 seconds. She counted. Not consciously. It was the kind of counting the body does on its own when the mind is too occupied with other calculations to monitor itself. 11 seconds of him looking at the screen with the particular stillness that she had learned to read as the outward surface of something moving very fast underneath. Then he handed it back. He didn't say anything immediately. The car moved through the city, and the driver, a man named Ortega, who had been with Cassian for 8 years and who understood, with the professional precision of someone whose continued employment depended on it, that some rides required absolute silence, kept his eyes on the road and his hands at 10 and 2, and gave no indication that anything in the back seat had changed. "How many people knew we were in Chicago?" Evelina said. It wasn't quite a question. "On my side," Cassian said. 6, including Ortega. She looked at the back of Ortega's head. He didn't move. "On mine," she said. "Nobody. I didn't tell anyone I was in Chicago." "Your firm, the client meeting. I rescheduled by text. I didn't say where I was calling from." She turned the phone over in her hands. The screen stayed dark. "I know what you did in Chicago, not what happened. What you did." She paused. "That's specific." "Yes." "Whoever sent this knows Chicago was my action, not yours." Cassian's head turned toward her by a fraction. She felt it rather than saw it. The slight reorientation of his attention, the recalibration. "You noticed that," he said. "You noticed it too." Immediately. She looked at the phone. 6 words, clean, short, no number attached to a name in any contact list she'd ever maintained. A burner, obviously. The kind that left a vapor trail if you knew where to look. And she had spent enough time adjacent to Cassian Moretti to understand that knowing where to look was the relevant skill set. "Can you trace it?" "Luca is already working on it." She hadn't seen him make a call. She hadn't seen him text. She looked at him. "While I was reading it the second time," he said. She nodded. She set the phone in her clutch and closed the clasp with a small, precise click. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and looked out the window and let herself, for the length of 3 breaths, be completely uncertain. Not performing composure, not reaching for it, just letting the uncertainty sit in her chest like cold water and acknowledging its temperature. The third breath out, she was done with that. "Tell me about Chicago," she said. "The parts you know that I don't." The mansion was quiet when they arrived. Staff had been dismissed for the evening. Cassian ran a tight, professional household that understood the distinction between nights when their presence was required and nights when it was the opposite, and this had been designated the latter before they'd left for the auction. The oceanfront rooms were dark except for the automated lighting that traced the path from the entrance to the main living area, and outside the glass walls the harbor moved in its slow and different way, lit from below by the city's ambient glow. Cassian poured 2 glasses of water. Not scotch, not wine. Water. She noticed this. It meant he wanted his mind sharp, which meant the conversation they were about to have required it. He set 1 glass in front of her at the kitchen island and kept one in his hand and stood across from her and looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was his version of respect. The willingness to hold difficult eye contact rather than let his gaze drift to the middle distance where it would be easier for both of them. "The night in Chicago," he said. "The men who came for me. The 3 who followed us to the loading bay. The attempt was coordinated across 4 positions. What you saw was one element. The primary vehicle was disabled 2 blocks north. That's where the bulk of the exchange happened. 3 of my people were injured, 1 critically." She absorbed this. She had known there was more. The 3 men in the shot she'd witnessed had not, even in the moment, had the quality of a complete event. But she hadn't asked, and he hadn't offered, and in the weeks immediately afterward, they had both been occupied with other dimensions of their developing situation. "Who ordered it?" she said. "A man named Pavel Kessler. He operates out of New York, primarily financial sector, surface-level legitimate. He and I have had a territorial disagreement regarding certain port operations for approximately 2 years." "Had?" Cassian's eyes were steady. "The disagreement was resolved 4 months ago." She held his gaze. "Resolved how?" "Kessler no longer operates in this part of the world." She understood what that meant. She had understood for a long time what that kind of language meant from this man. She had made a decision during the early months of their relationship about the ledger she was willing to keep and the one she was not, what she needed to know to make informed choices about her own life, and what she was willing to understand as the existing conditions of the world she had walked into. It was not a comfortable line. She had not drawn it pretending it was. "And the Chicago connection," she said. The 6 words. Cassian set his water glass down. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose, a gesture she had only seen from him 3 times, and each time it had indicated something at the far edge of his usual range of equanimity. "Kessler," he said, "was not acting alone in Chicago." She waited. He had a partner who provided the operational intelligence, timing, route, location of the hotel. He paused. "That partner knew about you before Chicago, knew you were in the city, knew you were at that hotel, knew that you had a connection to me through the wealth management work." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not public information," she said. "No." "The wealth management firm?" "Clean. I had them checked before you started." He picked up the water glass again, set it down without drinking. "The information about you came from Miami." She stared at him. "Someone in Miami," she said slowly, "told Kessler's partner where I was, knowing I would be near you, knowing what might happen. That's what the evidence suggested 4 months ago when I resolved the disagreement with Kessler." Another pause. "And that is what the message tonight confirms, because the only people who know the specific shape of your role that night in Chicago are the people who were there and the person in Miami who sold the information to begin with." She was quiet for a long time. She could hear the harbor outside. She could hear the faint electrical hum of the house's systems, climate control, security, the invisible infrastructure of a well-defended life. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No. 4 months ago, when you resolved it. You didn't tell me." "No." She looked at the water glass in front of her. She didn't pick it up. "Cassian, I know. No." Her voice stayed level, but something under it had shifted. She could hear it, and she knew he could too, The specific frequency of a woman who is not raising her voice because she has moved past the register where volume is the appropriate instrument. You don't get to say "I know" as though that concludes the sentence. You knew someone in Miami had tried to use me as a mechanism to get to you. You knew that person was still in Miami. You knew that when you married me. You knew that when you brought me back here tonight. He said nothing. That was its own answer. "Who is it?" she said. Silence. "Cassian. Who is it?" He looked at her across the kitchen island, and his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, which should have been a relief and was instead the most frightening thing about the moment, because a man like Cassian Moretti with an unguarded face meant the situation had reached a point where the performance had become irrelevant. "I have a strong suspicion," he said. "I don't have confirmation." "Tell me the suspicion." He told her. She listened. And then she stood very still in the quiet kitchen with the harbor moving outside the glass, and she experienced, in sequence, the following things. Disbelief, which lasted approximately 4 seconds. Revision of the past 6 months through the new lens, which took considerably longer and happened very fast, and left her feeling slightly physically ill in the way that rapid recalculation always does, when the numbers change everything you thought you'd already solved. And then, underneath both of those things, something that was not grief and not rage, but sat precisely between them like a load-bearing wall in a structure that is failing. "How long?" she said. "I've suspected since month 2. "Month 2? 2 months into—" She stopped. She pressed one hand flat on the kitchen counter. The stone was cold. She focused on that, the specific temperature of the counter against her palm, the solidity of it. 2 months in, and you said nothing. "I needed to be certain." "You needed to be certain," she repeated, "while someone who knew my location and your schedule was still in this city, while I was building a life here, while I was—" She stopped again. The hand on the counter pressed harder. "Who else knows your suspicion?" "Luca." "Just Luca?" "Yes." "So you've been carrying this for 4 months, you and Luca, and making decisions around it." She looked up at him. "The auction tonight." Something moved in his face. "The auction," she said again. "The Delacroix property. You said it was about rice, but if your suspicion is correct, then rice and—" She stopped, rebuilt the sequence, rebuilt it again. "You were smoking them out. Tonight was a trap, and I was the bait." "You were not bait," he said. His voice had an edge she didn't often hear. "Then what was I?" "The hand on the board that I trusted to play correctly. That is not the same as bait. The distinction feels very fine from where I'm standing." "I know." She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen held them in its careful quiet, and outside the harbor kept moving, and inside her chest something was working very hard at a problem that did not have a clean solution. "I need to know," she said carefully, "whether the person you suspect is capable of the message tonight. Whether they have the technical capacity to have traced the burner, to have been in that ballroom tonight and known the timing." "Yes," he said. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Opened them. "They were there tonight," she said. "In the ballroom. Yes, I believe so." She picked up the water glass. Drank. Set it down. "Show me what Luca has found." "What?" Luca Ferrante arrived at the mansion at 12:40 in the morning in dark clothes with a laptop and the specific energy of a man who had been awake for 22 hours and intended to be awake for several more. He was 34, compact, with a quick, precise face, and the habit of looking at every entrance and exit of every room he entered before he looked at the people in it. He had worked for Cassian for 6 years and was, as far as Evelina had been able to determine, the person in Cassian's world whose intelligence he trusted most completely. He looked at Evelina when he came in the way he always looked at her, direct, assessing, without the residual uncertainty that some of Cassian's other people still carried when they dealt with her. He had formed his opinion of her early and had not revised it, and the opinion was apparently sufficient because he treated her with the businesslike respect he gave anyone who had earned a position rather than been assigned one. "The burner traces to a purchase at a convenience store on Biscayne," he said, before he'd fully sat down. "Cash. 2 weeks ago. No camera coverage of the transaction." 2 weeks, Evelina said, before the auction was publicly confirmed. Luca looked at her. "Yes." The auction was confirmed on the society page 11 days ago. So the message was prepared before the event was public. Or the sender knew about the event before it went public, which is its own kind of information. She nodded. She looked at Cassian, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on Luca's laptop screen. "The ballroom's private security footage," she said. "Can you get it?" Luca's mouth compressed slightly. The expression she had learned that meant the question was reasonable, but the answer was complicated. "The auction security runs through a private firm. I have a contact there. It'll take until morning." "Get it?" He glanced at Cassian. Cassian gave a slight nod. Not permission exactly, more like confirmation that they were aligned, which she noted and filed. "There's something else," Luca said. He opened a second window on the laptop and turned it toward them. "Grayson Vale's financial exposure. You asked me to keep monitoring." Cassian unfolded his arms and came to the island. Evelina moved to stand beside him. The screen showed a series of transaction records, the kind of document that should not have been accessible to anyone outside specific regulatory bodies, and certainly not displayed in a private kitchen in the middle of the night, that traced the movement of money through a series of holding companies with the particular Baroque complexity of structures designed to obscure rather than organize. "He's 3 months from a margin call he cannot meet," Luca said. "The primary creditor is a Luxembourg entity that was established 18 months ago. The ultimate beneficial owner of the Luxembourg entity." He paused. Not for effect, for the specific courtesy of giving them both a moment before the information landed. "Is Dario Rice?" The kitchen was very quiet. "Rice owns Grayson's debt," Evelina said. "Effectively, yes. Since before the divorce." Luca looked at the screen. "The Luxembourg entity was established 22 months ago. Your divorce was finalized 19 months ago." He looked up. "So yes, before." She stood very still. She was aware of Cassian beside her, of the fact that he was not looking at her, of the careful quality of his not looking at her. The consideration of a man who understood that some revelations required space and was attempting to provide it without making the provision visible. 22 months ago, Grayson Vale had been in debt to a man connected to the same network that had tried to kill her husband. 22 months ago, while she had been attending galas and defending him during scandals and building his empire behind closed doors, Grayson had been structuring a financial dependency with Dario Rice. 19 months ago, he had divorced her. She thought about this with the cold, systematic focus of someone taking a damaged structure apart to find the load-bearing element. She thought about the timeline. She thought about what a man owning catastrophic debt to a dangerous creditor might be motivated to do, and not do, to protect his position. She thought about what leverage looked like from the inside of a marriage to a man who needed it. She thought about this conversation she'd had with Cassian 3 hours ago in the car, the suspicion he'd shared, the name, and something clicked into place, not gently, the way a heavy lock clicks, with mass and finality and the sound of a door that is just committed to being closed. "He knew about Cassian before Chicago," she said. She wasn't asking anymore, she was building. "Grayson knew who I was with. He'd been watching me, or having me watched, since I left Miami. And Rice is connected to Kessler's network through 2 intermediaries," Luca said. His voice was carefully flat. "I found this 4 months ago as well." She looked at Cassian. "You knew Grayson was involved," she said. "That's who you suspected." Cassian's face was doing nothing at all. That was its own answer. "You suspected my ex-husband fed my location to the people who tried to kill you. In a city I chose independently, on a night I happened to be there." She heard her own voice, steady. She was grateful for that, not because she cared about composure for its own sake, but because she needed her mind working, and her mind worked better when her body wasn't fighting her. "And you married me without telling me." "I married you," he said, "because I was certain of who you were. I was not yet certain enough of Grayson to act, and I did not tell you because why?" A pause, long, honest. "Because you had just spent 10 years with a man who made decisions about your life without telling you," he said, "and I was not—" He stopped. In 6 months, she had not heard him stop in the middle of a sentence. "I was handling it," he said, "badly." She looked at him for a long time. The terrible thing was that she understood it. She could see the architecture of his reasoning. The protection impulse warped by the same thing that had warped Grayson's, the conviction that managing a situation was the same as being honest about it, the fundamental misapprehension that keeping someone safe and keeping someone informed were in conflict. She could see it, and she could understand it, and she could simultaneously hold the knowledge that understanding a mistake was not the same as it not being one. "What does Grayson get," she said, "if Rice is satisfied? If the debt gets restructured?" "Survival," Luca said. "Financially, the margin call disappears." "And what does Rice get?" Luca looked at his laptop. He didn't answer. She looked at him. "Luca, what does Rice get?" Luca looked at Cassian. Cassian gave a very slight nod. Luca turned the laptop screen toward her again. A different document. A name at the top. Her name. She read it. She read the whole thing. It took 4 minutes because it was detailed, and she read carefully, and she did not allow herself to react until she had finished. And when she finished, she set the laptop down on the counter with both hands and took one breath and then another, and then said very quietly, "They want me to testify." "Against Cassian," Luca said, "in a federal proceeding. You'd be classified as a material witness with personal knowledge of—" "I know what I'd be classified as." She looked at the document. "This was filed 3 weeks ago." "Yes." "Before the auction?" "Yes." "Grayson signed this." She could see his name, his signature, the one she'd watched him write on their divorce papers 19 months ago, with the practiced, legible hand of a man who had been signing important documents his whole adult life. "He went to a federal office and signed a document identifying me as a potential material witness and provided supporting information." "The supporting information," Cassian said, from where he stood near the window, "was fabricated. It won't hold up." "That's not the point." She turned to look at him. "The point is that he did it. The point is that someone told him about Chicago. Someone who knew what happened that night in enough detail to construct a narrative. And he took that information to a federal office and used it to come after me." She felt something then that she had been successfully suppressing for the past 40 minutes. Something that had been building since she read the 6 words on the phone in the car, and she let it surface long enough to identify it, and then she pressed it back down because she needed to be functional, and she intended to be functional, and she was not going to let Grayson Vale, not even now, not even this, be the thing that took that from her. "He's trying to flip me," she said. "He thinks if he can make me afraid enough, I'll trade what I know about Cassian to protect myself." "Yes," Cassian said. "Does he understand that I don't know enough to actually damage you in a federal proceeding? He thinks proximity is knowledge. It usually is, in his world." She looked at the document. Her name, printed in the clean, indifferent font of official documentation. Evelina Moretti, née Royce. The name she had chosen. The name on the ring. The name that someone had decided made her useful, and someone else had decided made her a target. She picked up her phone. She set it on the counter face up. She looked at the 6 words one more time, and then she locked the screen. "The person who sent this message," she said. "The person who knows the specific details of Chicago. Who knew my location? Who has a connection to Rice's network?" She stopped. She rebuilt the logic chain one more time, all the way from the beginning, the way she'd learned to do in the firm on Michigan Avenue. The way you trace money backward through holding companies. Not from cause to effect, but from effect to cause. From the present reality back through its own history. She traced it. She found the end of the thread. She pulled. The name she arrived at was not Grayson's. "It's not Grayson," she said. Luca looked at his hands. "He doesn't have the operational capacity," she said. "He's a builder. He makes structures. He doesn't run intelligence. Someone fed him the Chicago information, gave it to him in enough detail to construct the federal document. Someone who was in Chicago. Someone with access to Kessler's network, and to Rice, and to Grayson." She paused. "Someone who has been managing all 3 of those connections simultaneously." She looked at Cassian. "Someone you trusted," she said. The silence in the kitchen was the specific kind that comes after an explosion. Not the explosion itself, but the moment after, when the structure hasn't yet finished deciding whether it's going to stand. Cassian's eyes were on her face. "Say it," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Luca," she said. She didn't look away from Cassian. "Pull up the records for the Luxembourg entity, the access logs, the internal communication structure." She paused. And then tell me who, 6 months ago, was in a position to know both that I was in Chicago and that Cassian would be on that street that night. Luca's hands were on the laptop. He wasn't opening it. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the flat, scanning eyes she had attributed to professional training, and which she was now, with the specific, nauseating clarity of a person who has just understood the shape of a room by touching the walls in the dark. Understanding was something else entirely. "Luca," Cassian said. The word was not loud. It was not a question. It had the quality of a door being taken off its hinges, not forceful, but irreversible. Luca set both hands flat on the counter. He looked at Cassian. The expression on his face was the most honest thing she had seen all night. No performance, no preparation, the raw and terrible face of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. 8 years, Cassian said, still quiet, still without inflection. 8 years, Luca said. Tell me why. Luca closed his eyes. He opened them, and then he told them. The why was not simple. It never was. She knew that. She had understood it intellectually for a long time. That betrayal at this scale did not come from simple motives, because simple motives did not sustain 8 years of careful, patient deception. It came from the compound weight of accumulated grievance and compromised loyalty and the specific human capacity to tell yourself a story about why the thing you're doing is not the thing it actually is. Luca had a sister. The sister had a debt. The debt had gone to Rice's network 18 months before Luca was approached, a timeline that meant Rice had engineered the vulnerability before he'd leveraged it, which told her something about Rice's operational patience that was worth holding on to. The approach had been careful, gradual, framed as information exchange rather than betrayal, framed as protecting the sister rather than endangering the boss, framed. And this was the part she could see hitting Cassian like something physical, even as he stood perfectly still across the kitchen, as temporary, controllable, contained. It had been none of those things. When Luca finished, the kitchen held the three of them in a silence that had weight and temperature and the specific quality of a moment that is permanently dividing time into before and after. She watched Cassian. He was looking at Luca with the gray February ice eyes that she had learned could mean almost anything, and right now meant something she could not fully read because she had never seen it before. Something that was grief and fury and the particular devastation of a man whose professional worldview has just been revised at the deepest load-bearing level. 8 years. The person he had trusted most. The person who had known everything. She understood in that moment with absolute clarity that the plan she had carried back to Miami, the measured, strategic, patient reclamation of her own life, was no longer the plan she was inside. The plan had changed. The board had changed. The game had changed in ways that neither she nor Cassian had fully mapped, and they were standing in a kitchen at 1 a.m. with a federal document bearing her name and a man they'd trusted who had just confessed to being the mechanism of their near destruction, and the only relevant question was the forward one. She straightened. She picked up her water glass and finished it and set it down. She looked at Cassian, held his gaze until he turned from Luca and met her eyes, and when he did, she saw the moment he came back to himself. The moment the devastation receded behind the composure. The moment the man she had married stepped back to the front. She said quietly and without hesitation, "We have until morning before the federal document becomes actionable. Tell me what needs to happen before then, and tell me what you need me to do." Cassian looked at her, and in the specific, unguarded way of a man who had just lost the person he trusted most and found someone he trusted more standing in their place, he said, "Everything is going to change tonight." "I know," she said. "Not just Luca, not just Rice. Everything." She held his gaze. "Then let's start," she said. And behind her on the kitchen counter, her phone lit up with a second message from the same dead number. 6 words again, different ones this time. And when she turned to read them, the color drained from her face for the first time all night. Because whatever she had prepared herself for, whatever she had built herself into over the past 6 months, whatever she had become in that courthouse bathroom and in that Chicago winter and in this marble kitchen at 1 a.m, she had not prepared for this. The second message read, "Your mother is in Miami, room 412." Evelina did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up the phone with both hands and read it again, and the words did not change, and the room did not change, and the harbor outside did not change. And none of those things mattered because her mother had been in a care facility in Sarasota for 2 years, had been there quietly and safely, and completely removed from anything to do with Miami or Grayson or the life Evelina had spent 6 months dismantling and rebuilding. And the only people who knew about her mother, who knew about the facility, the arrangement, the careful financial infrastructure Evelina had set up to keep her there and keep her comfortable and keep her invisible, were a lawyer in Sarasota and one person in Miami. One person. She looked up at Cassian. "My mother," she said. He was already moving toward her. He read the message over her shoulder. His hand came to her arm, not gripping, steadying, and she felt the specific quality of his stillness against her back, the way he went absolutely motionless when his mind was running fastest. "Who knew?" he said. "One person." She looked at Luca. "One person in Miami knew about my mother." Luca's face had gone gray. He was still sitting at the counter where he had confessed, hands flat on the surface, and the grayness in his face now was not guilt. She'd seen the guilt already, had cataloged it, and set it aside. This was something else. This was fear. The specific physical fear of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought he was controlling had been controlling him. "Luca," Cassian said. His voice had changed. Not loud, not raised, but there was something in it that hadn't been there before. A quality of absolute zero, the temperature at which things stopped moving entirely. "Did you tell them about her mother?" "No." Fast, genuine. "I swear to you, no, I didn't know. I didn't." He stopped. His hands pressed harder on the counter. "I didn't know she had a mother in Sarasota. Rice never... That wasn't in anything I gave them." "Then who?" Evelina said. The three of them held the question. She was already thinking through it, already running the list of everyone who knew. The Sarasota lawyer who had no connection to Miami, the facility staff who knew her as Ms. Royce and nothing else, and the one person she'd told in Miami because she'd needed someone to know, needed a human being in this city to hold that information in case something happened to her, in case she needed help. In the early weeks after the divorce, when she'd been raw and frightened underneath the composure and had made exactly one error of trust. "Vivian," she said. The name landed in the kitchen like a stone, because Vivian Cortez, whose husband moved money through structures that benefited from being unexamined, Vivian, who had been kind in the visible, photographable way, Vivian, who had appeared at her elbow tonight with a warm smile and sharp eyes, and who had left with information. Vivian had known about the mother since month 2 of the divorce, when Evelina had been less than herself, and had sat in Vivian's kitchen drinking coffee, and had said, just once, just quietly, "My mother is safe, she's in Sarasota. At least I know she's safe." One sentence. 8 months ago. She put the phone in her clutch. She looked at Cassian. "I need a car," she said. "No." Cassian. Not alone. His hand tightened on her arm. Not tonight, not with Rice activated and the federal document live and Luca. He stopped. He looked at Luca. Something passed between them. Fast, complex. The compressed communication of 8 years that was now permanently reclassified. "Where is she?" he said to Luca. "Room 412 of what?" "I don't know," Luca said. "Find out." Luca had his phone out before Cassian finished the sentence. Evelina moved to the window. She pressed one hand against the glass. The harbor below was dark and indifferent, and the city beyond it was lit and restless, and somewhere in it her mother, 71 years old, early-stage memory difficulties, a woman who had no idea that her daughter had married a man that federal prosecutors found interesting, was in a hotel room on the 4th floor of somewhere, and the people who had put her there were waiting to see what Evelina would do about it. She knew what they wanted her to do about it. That was the calculated elegance of the move. It didn't require her to do anything complicated. It only required her to be a daughter, which was the one identity she had never performed, never edited, never made smaller to fit someone else's narrative. The one thing that was real and ungoverned, and therefore the one lever that actually worked. She breathed. She thought about what Cassian had said. Everything is going to change tonight. She thought about what she'd said back. Then let's start. She took her hand off the glass. "They want me to come to her," she said. "That's the point. They can't compel the federal testimony without a process that takes weeks. But if I walk into that room, they have something immediate, presence, contact. They can document it. They can use it. Yes, Cassian said. So I'm not going to walk into that room as myself. He looked at her. I'm going to walk into that room, she said, as exactly what they think they've already made me, a frightened woman running to protect her mother. She turned from the window. And while I'm doing that, you're going to have everything in place. Every piece, Rice, the federal document, Grayson, all of it simultaneously before morning. The kitchen was very quiet. Simultaneously, Cassian said. Race made the mistake of moving everything at once, she said. He activated Luca and Grayson and the federal document and my mother in the same night, because he thought tonight was the moment. He thought the auction, the bid on Delacroix, your exposure, he thought it all broke at once, and he moved everything to capitalize. She held Cassian's gaze. That means he's overextended, and overextended is the only thing I know how to work with. Cassian looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that could mean almost anything. All right, he said. The hotel was the Meridian on Brickell. Luca found it in 11 minutes through a contact at a private security firm that monitored hotel registrations for high-net-worth clients. Room 412, registered under a name that was not her mother's, checked in 6 hours ago, before the auction, which meant this had been arranged before the evening began, before the message was sent, before anyone had needed to activate it. Contingency planning. The mark of someone who thought in chess rather than checkers. The drive took 8 minutes. Ortega drove. Cassian sat beside her in the back, and in the confined dark of the moving car, he laid out the framework in the compressed, precise language he used when time was the constraint rather than complexity. Marco and 2 others would enter the hotel from the service entrance before she arrived and secure the floor. Nothing visible. Nothing that announced itself. Positions only. He would be in the lobby when she went up. Not with her, not visible, but present in the way that he was always present in situations he had calculated. Close enough to close the distance fast. She would have her phone in her hand, open channel to Luca, who was simultaneously working 3 things from the mansion: the Luxembourg financial chain, the federal document through a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office who owed Cassian a debt that had never been collected, and Vivienne Cortez's current location. What do you want me to do with Vivienne? Luca had asked as they were leaving. She had stopped at the door. She had thought about it. Nothing yet, she said. Vivienne is peripheral. She was used because she was useful. What I want is the person who decided to use her. Luca had nodded. She had not looked back. Now the Meridian appeared through the windshield, 40 floors of glass and steel with the anonymous, well-maintained face of a hotel that served corporate travelers and people who needed to be somewhere without being anywhere in particular. Ortega pulled to the curb half a block south. Cassian got out first, walked ahead without looking back, and disappeared through the main entrance. She gave it 90 seconds. Then she walked in. So the elevator was mirrored, and she looked at herself in it and thought about the woman she was walking toward the 4th floor to perform. The frightened woman, the daughter, the one who ran when her family was threatened. She thought about whether she could do it convincingly, whether she could find that woman inside herself after 6 months of building her way out of her. She found her easily. That was the thing about the version of yourself you've worked hard to leave. She doesn't disappear. She waits. She knows you, and when you need her, she's right there. And the performance is not a lie so much as a key you thought you'd melted down that you discover you still have the shape of. 4th floor. The corridor was the beige and gold of hotels that spend on the lobby and amortize on everything else. Room 412 was midway down on the right. She could see light under the door. She knocked. A pause. Then the door opened and a man she had never seen before was standing in it, mid-40s, thick-necked, in a jacket that was doing poor work of concealing the shape of what was under it. He looked at her face. He stepped back without speaking. She walked in. Her mother was sitting in the upholstered chair by the window in her nightclothes, and the sight of her, small and confused and slightly frightened in the way she got now when things were unfamiliar, the particular bewilderment of a mind that had begun losing its reliable access to context, hit Evelina in a place that had nothing to do with strategy or composition or any of the training she'd done on herself over the past 6 months. She crossed the room and crouched in front of the chair and took her mother's hands. "Hi, Mom." Her mother looked at her. For a moment, That terrible held breath moment she had learned to brace for, there was no recognition. Then something cleared, the way it did sometimes, like a cloud passing and leaving a patch of ordinary light. Evie, her mother's hands tightened on hers. I don't know where I am. I know, it's okay. I'm here. They said there was a problem with my room, at the other place. I know, there wasn't. I'm going to fix it. She stood up slowly. She turned. Dario Rice was standing in the doorway of the adjoining room. He was shorter than she had expected. She had formed an image of him from the ballroom distance, from Cassian's careful descriptions, from the financial documents and the transaction records and the operational intelligence that added up to a picture of significant power, and somehow power at that scale had constructed itself in her imagination as physically large. He was not. He was a compact man in his mid-50s in a gray suit, with a weathered face and dark eyes that moved over her the way a contractor's eyes move over a building. Assessing load, calculating cost, looking for structural weakness. Mrs. Moretti, he said. His voice was mild. That was the most frightening thing about him, she registered. The mildness. The complete absence of visible intensity. The manner of a man who had long ago stopped needing to signal that he was dangerous because everyone in the room already knew. Mr. Rice, she said, sit down. I'm fine standing. A pause. He looked at the thick-necked man who moved to stand between her and the door. She noted this without reacting to it. The open channel to Luca was live in her phone in her left hand. She kept her left hand still. Your mother seems well, Rice said. He glanced toward the chair. Her mother was watching them with the slightly unfocused attention of someone trying to follow a conversation in a language they once knew. 71. Early stage cognitive decline. The facility in Sarasota has been very good for her. Is there a point coming? Evelina said. The point, Rice said, is simple. You're an intelligent woman. You understand the federal proceeding. You understand that your husband's position is, let's say, exposed. We're asking for your cooperation with a process that will cost you nothing personally and will result in a very clean resolution for everyone, including your mother, including you. You want me to testify against Cassian. We want your account of certain events, including Chicago. I don't have an account of Chicago that's useful to you. We think otherwise. Then you're wrong. She kept her voice level. She looked at him steadily. I was a bystander in Chicago. I have no knowledge of Cassian's operations, his finances, his organizational structure, or anything else you would need for a federal proceeding. I'm a wealth management consultant. I married a man I met during a difficult period of my life. That's my account. Reese looked at her for a moment. Then, without changing his expression, he said, Vivian Cortez had a very different sense of what you discussed during your time in Miami. Vivian Cortez, Evelina said, knows that I drink my coffee black and that I grew up in Chicago and that my mother lives in Sarasota. None of that is federal testimony. Vivian Courts also knows that you had dinner with Cassian Moretti in Chicago 3 days after the assassination attempt, before you told anyone you'd been in contact with him, before you returned to Miami. He paused. That's a timeline that tells a story. It tells a story about a woman who had dinner with a man she'd met under difficult circumstances. That's it. The federal attorney sees it differently. Then the federal attorney is building something out of nothing, and any competent defense makes that clear inside of a week. Rice tilted his head slightly. A week is a long time, he said. A week of federal scrutiny on your husband's operations is significant, regardless of outcome. He let that settle. We're not asking you to destroy him. We're asking for a conversation, a formal statement that confirms the timeline. The rest takes care of itself. She looked at him. She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, and she understood the specific architecture of the offer, the way it was framed as small, as limited, as merely confirming something, which was how these things always began and never ended. She understood that Cassian, somewhere below her in the lobby, had heard every word on the open channel and was currently inside a set of calculations that she was also running, and that they were either arriving at the same place or they were about to find out something important about how well they actually knew each other. She said, I want to speak to my mother privately. Rice considered this. He nodded to the thick-necked man who moved toward the adjoining door. 2 minutes, Rice said. She crouched down in front of her mother's chair again. She took her mother's hands. She said very quietly, "Mom, I need you to listen carefully. In about 3 minutes, someone is going to come and take you to a different hotel. A nice one. You're going to go with them and it's going to be fine, okay?" Her mother looked at her. "Is everything all right?" "It's going to be," she said. "It's going to be fine. I promise." Her mother nodded slowly. Her hands were warm and dry. The hands Evelina had held for 40 years, the hands that had been the first familiar thing in her life. She held them for 1 extra second, and then she stood up and turned around. Rice was watching her. "My answer," she said, "is no." The room changed temperature. "Mrs. Moretti, no." She kept her voice steady. "Here is what's going to happen instead. The Luxembourg entity, the one that holds Grayson Vale's debt, the one you established 22 months ago, has had its beneficial ownership structure filed with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network as of 40 minutes ago. That filing was initiated by a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and it supersedes and functionally invalidates the document that Grayson Vale signed identifying me as a material witness, because the document Grayson signed was itself procured through financial coercion, which the Luxembourg filing demonstrates." She paused. "You coerced Grayson. That makes everything he signed for you compromised." Reese was very still. "The Delacroix property," she continued, "which I purchased tonight contains, in its title documentation, in the chain of custody going back 11 years, a recorded encumbrance that ties 3 of your port-adjacent holdings to the Luxembourg entity and therefore to the FinCEN filing. That's not my legal work, that's yours. You built it that way because you needed the asset flexibility. It works against you now." She watched his face. The mildness was still there. It was taking more effort. "And Luca Ferrante," she said, "who you leveraged through his sister's debt, has spent the last hour providing a complete and detailed account of his 8-year operational involvement to the same contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He did this voluntarily. His sister's debt has been satisfied. He has nothing left for you to hold." The silence in the room was absolute. The thick-necked man was looking at Rice. Reese was looking at Evelina. She held his gaze, and she did not look away, and she did not move, and she kept her breathing even and slow. And she let the silence run because she had learned from a man who knew how to use silence that you never fill it when you're the one holding the better cards. "You should know," Rice said. And his voice had changed. The mildness was still surface, but underneath it now she could hear the machinery. "That I have people. In this building, on this floor." "I know," she said. "So does my husband." His jaw moved. "And Vivian Cortez," she said, "is currently being interviewed by a reporter from the Miami Herald who covers financial crime, to whom she is providing the account of her husband's transactions that she has been sitting on for 3 years because she was afraid and because no one had ever given her a reason to believe that being afraid was optional." She paused. "I gave her that reason, tonight, before we left the auction. When I told her what I know about her husband's accounts, and what it means, and what she could do about it if she chose to." The machinery under Rice's face was audible now. She had not told Cassian about Vivian. She had made that decision on her own, in the car, in the 90 seconds between understanding what Vivian was and understanding what Vivian could be, the difference between a source of vulnerability and a source of leverage, and the specific personal knowledge she had of Vivian's marriage that no one else in this situation possessed. She had made the call from Ortega's front seat while Cassian watched the hotel entrance. She had kept it to herself because there were still things she could do on her own, decisions that were hers, moves on this board that belonged to her, and no one else. "You're bluffing," Rice said. "Check your phone," she said. He didn't move for 3 seconds. Then he reached into his jacket and checked his phone. She watched his face. She saw the exact moment he read whatever was on the screen, the moment the mildness cracked. Not spectacularly, not with the dramatic visible collapse of a man who is lost, but with the specific, subtle compression of a face that has just had its internal load-bearing structure shift. A hairline fracture. Invisible unless you knew where to look. She knew where to look. "The reporter's name is Diaz," she said. "She's been covering the Port District for 2 years, and she has been waiting for a source with direct financial knowledge. Vivian is that source. She looked at him. You moved everything tonight because you thought tonight was the moment, and you were right. It was. It just wasn't yours. Rice put his phone back in his pocket. The thick-necked man shifted his weight. The door to the room opened. Cassian walked in. He was not moving fast. He never moved fast. She had noticed this about him from the beginning, the way urgency expressed itself in him as compression rather than speed, the way his stillness became more precise rather than less as the temperature of a situation rose. He was in the same suit he'd worn to the auction, the black that absorbed light, and he came to stand beside her without touching her and looked at Rice with the gray eyes that had nothing in them that was personal. Dario, he said. Rice looked at him. Cassian. A pause. The room held 4 people, and the weight of everything that had led to this specific configuration and the specific quality of a silence that precedes the final movement of a thing that has been in motion for a long time. Your position, Cassian said, has changed significantly in the last hour. I'm aware. The port contracts, the Luxembourg structure, the Veil debt. He said each one with the flat naming quality of a man reading a list he has had memorized for a long time. The FinCEN filing is active. The U.S. attorney has Luca's account. The Herald has Vivian's account. He paused. You have tonight to decide how you'd like the next phase to proceed. Rice looked at him. His face had gone through its revisions and had come out the other side at something that was not defeat exactly. He was not a man who did defeat visibly, but was the specific corporate hardness of a man who has recalculated and found the number insufficient. What do you want? Rice said. The Veil debt, Cassian said. Assigned. To me. A beat. And the port contracts? Relinquished. All of them. That's everything. Yes. Reese was quiet for a long time. Evelina stood beside Cassian, and she could feel the heat of him close to her arm, and she could feel her own heartbeat. Steady, faster than normal. The body's honest account of what it costs to stand in a room like this and hold your ground. And Grayson Vale, Rice said. Cassian looked at him. He said nothing. He came to me, Rice said, 6 weeks ago. He brought the information about Chicago. He framed it as a business arrangement. He paused. He's not what you think he is. I know exactly what he is, Cassian said. He knows things, Rice said. About operations. About the port timeline. About... He knows what you told him, Cassian said, which means he knows what you wanted him to know, which means you managed his knowledge the way you manage everything else. He paused. Grayson Vale is not my concern tonight. Something moved behind Rice's eyes. She caught it, filed it. The thick-necked man was still standing between her and the door. She looked at him. He looked at Rice. Rice gave a slight movement of his head, small, almost invisible, and the thick-necked man stepped back. I'll need 24 hours, Rice said. You have until 6 a.m., Cassian said. Another long pause. All right, Rice said. Cassian looked at Evelina. She looked at her mother, still sitting in the chair by the window, watching all of them with the slightly unfocused attention of a woman who was tracking something she couldn't quite name. She walked to the chair. She held out her hand. Come on, Mom, she said. We're going somewhere better. Her mother took her hand and stood up slowly and looked around the room. At the thick-necked man, at Rice, at Cassian standing in the doorway, with the particular unclouded perception that sometimes came through the confusion like a signal through static, the animal intelligence that remained even when the context did. Who are all these people? Her mother said. She squeezed her mother's hand. People who made a mistake, she said. She walked her mother to the door. Cassian held it open. They moved into the corridor. The beige and gold carpet, the low ceiling, the anonymous fluorescent quiet of a hotel at 2 a.m, and behind her she heard the door to 412 close, and the click of it was the sound of something ending and something else not yet beginning, the specific suspended note between a question and its answer, and she kept walking because that was the only direction that remained. Marco was waiting at the elevator with a jacket for her mother and a car already confirmed downstairs, and as they stepped in and the doors closed, Evelina looked at her reflection in the mirrored elevator wall. Her face, the diamond at her throat, the ring on her left hand, all of it exactly as it had been 6 hours ago when the evening started, and all of it completely different. And she thought about what was still unfinished. Rice had agreed. The documents would move, the port contracts would transfer, the veiled debt would assign. But Rice had said something in the last 2 minutes of that room that she was still holding, still turning, still examining from every angle for the thing she was afraid it meant. He's not what you think he is. And then, he knows things about the port timeline. She had assumed the car from the auction that Grayson had been the passive element, the desperate, frightened debtor who had been handed information about Chicago and had used it opportunistically, the way a drowning man uses whatever is close. She had built her entire read of his position around that assumption. But Rice didn't protect his assets. Not people, not information, not leverage. He would not have walked into an exchange and offered Grayson Vale's knowledge as a bargaining chip unless that knowledge was real and current and significant enough to be worth offering, which meant Grayson knew something that wasn't from Rice, something operational, something about the port timeline. The elevator opened on the lobby. Cassian's hand was at her back again. She leaned close to him and said, very quietly, in the 2 seconds before they entered the lobby's open space and the context changed again. Grayson, where is he right now? She felt Cassian's hand still against her back. Why? He said. Because Rice just told us something without meaning to, she said. And if I'm right about what it means, we have approximately 3 hours before Grayson Vale does something that makes everything we built tonight. The lobby doors opened and the Miami night came in, thick and salt-damp and full of the city's relentless, indifferent noise. And across the lobby she saw Ortega straighten from where he'd been standing against the far wall, and she saw his face. And his face told her that whatever she'd been about to say was already too late, because something had already happened, and the 3 hours she'd thought they had had just become... Ortega said 4 words. Vale. He's running. Cassian moved first. Not fast. That deliberate, compressed motion that she had learned meant his mind had already completed the calculation, and his body was simply executing it. He had his phone out before they reached the lobby doors, and she heard him say Ortega's name once, low and flat, the tone that communicated everything without saying any of it. Her mother was with Marco. She looked back once. Marco had her arm, was guiding her toward the elevator with the professional gentleness of a man who had been briefed and understood the assignment. And her mother looked back too, that brief moment of eye contact across the lobby, and in the clarity that sometimes came through the confusion, her mother's face said, I know you're handling something, and I trust you, and go, Evie, go. She went. The Miami night outside was thick and wet, and the street was the specific controlled chaos of 2 a.m, cabs, a cluster of people outside the hotel entrance, the ambient noise of a city that never fully quieted. Ortega had the car running at the curb. She got in the back with Cassian, and before the door was fully closed, he had 3 different calls running simultaneously in a language she had learned enough of to follow the operational outline. Grayson had left the Black Orchid auction at 11:47. His driver had taken him not to the Brickell penthouse, but to the port of Miami, specifically to a private marina on the southeastern edge that served the class of boat that large amounts of untraceable capital could purchase and fuel and have ready without attracting the specific attention that made government agencies interested. He's not running from you, she said. Cassian looked at her. He's running from Rice, she said. He heard something tonight, at the auction or after. Someone told him the Luxembourg filing was moving. He knows that when that files completely, he's not just Rice's debtor anymore. He's a documented participant in a compromised financial structure. She was building it as she said it, the pieces falling into their correct sequence. If he gets on that boat, he disappears with whatever he has left. No testimony, no document. No Grayson Vale to connect race to anything because Grayson Vale is in international waters. Yes, Cassian said. Rice knew this might happen, she said. That's why he offered Grayson's knowledge as a bargaining chip tonight. He was hedging. If Grayson ran, Rice could still claim he'd attempted cooperation. Cassian said nothing. He was looking at his phone. How far is the marina? She said. 12 minutes. Do you have people there? In 8 minutes I will. She looked out the window. The city moved past. She thought about Grayson Vale. Not the man she'd been married to. Not the man at the auction with the practiced smooth voice and the boardroom mask. but the frightened version underneath all of that. The version that had existed for at least 22 months in secret. The man who had borrowed from Rice because he needed weight, and then discovered that what he'd borrowed was a collar. She thought about what it cost to be that man. The specific exhaustion of holding a performance together while the structure beneath it rotted. The way that kind of fear calcified into the cruelty of small decisions. The way a trapped man made everyone around him smaller to make himself feel less trapped. She did not forgive him, but she understood the shape of him, finally, completely, without the distortion of love or the distortion of anger. Just the clear, unsentimental understanding of one person looking at another and seeing the actual dimensions. "I want to be there," she said. Cassian looked at her. "I need to be there," she said. "This ends tonight. All of it." "And Grayson?" She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "He needs to hear it from me, not from your people, not from a federal proceeding, from me." She held Cassian's gaze. "That's not negotiable." A long pause. The car moved. "All right," he said. The marina smelled like salt and diesel and the particular humid darkness of Miami water at night. The dock lights were low, amber-toned, spaced far enough apart to leave stretches of genuine shadow between them, and the boats moved in their slips with the slow, restless motion of things that wanted to be elsewhere. 300 yards down the dock, a vessel was running its engines. Not moving yet, warming up. She could see Grayson on the dock beside it. He was alone, or he thought he was. He had a bag. One, carry-on sized, the bag of a man who had packed for this scenario in advance and had hoped not to need it. He was in the same suit from the auction, but the jacket was off and his shirt sleeves were rolled, and he was standing at the stern of the boat, talking to whoever was at the helm, and his posture was the posture of a man running a calculation that was coming up short. She walked down the dock. She didn't run. She had thought about running, the operational logic of it, closing distance faster, preventing departure. And she had decided against it because she was not going to arrive breathless and chasing. She was going to arrive the way she had arrived at everything tonight, on her feet, at her own pace, choosing the moment. Cassian's people were already on the dock. She could sense them, positioned at the dock entrance, at the boat's bow, at the fuel station 20 yards north, without being able to see most of them. The invisible architecture of his reach. She walked through it without acknowledging it because it was not hers to acknowledge. It was his, and it was there, and that was enough. Grayson heard her footsteps on the dock boards when she was 15 feet away. He turned. The expression on his face moved through several things very fast. Shock, then a complicated compound of guilt and defiance, then the reaching for composure that was his oldest reflex. She watched it all and said nothing until she stopped in front of him, close enough to see the sweat along his hairline and the specific redness in his eyes, of a man who had been drinking since approximately 9 o'clock and was functioning through it by force of practice. "Eve," he said. "Put the bag down," she said. A pause. His jaw tightened. "I don't have anything to say to you," he said. "I know, you're going to listen instead." The boat engine ran behind him, low and purposeful. He looked past her once, and she knew what he was looking for. How many, where, whether running was still calculable. And she knew from the way his eyes came back to her face that he had done the math and found it closed. He put the bag down. She looked at him. Really looked. Not managing him, not protecting herself from what she saw, not filtering through what he had been to her. She looked at the man who had spent 22 months building a structure that was designed to cost her everything, and she let herself feel the full dimensions of that, the full weight of the specific, deliberate choice to use her as a mechanism for his own survival. Then she let it go. Not because it didn't matter, because she was done carrying it. "You signed that document," she said. "The federal filing. You gave them my name." He looked at her. He didn't deny it. "You told Rice about Chicago," she said. "Luca told you what happened, and you took that information to a federal office and used it to make me useful to you." Still nothing. His throat worked. "Look at me," she said. He was already looking at her. She meant something different. "You tried to make me small enough to save yourself," she said. "Again, it's the same thing you did for 10 years. You needed me reduced so you felt sufficient. And when I stopped being reducible, you tried to make me into a weapon someone else could use against my husband." She paused. I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this because I need you to apologize or because I need you to understand what you did. I don't need either of those things. She held his gaze. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I see exactly what you are. Not the story you tell. Not the performance. The actual thing. And it's not remarkable. It's not villainous. It's just afraid. A frightened man who borrowed money from the wrong person and spent 2 years making decisions he couldn't face. Something cracked in his face. Small. Genuine. Eve. The Luxembourg filing is active, she said. Rice's structure is exposed. The document you signed has been superseded, and the legal contact who processed it has been provided with the evidence of financial coercion, which means your signature on that document is a liability for you rather than a weapon against me. She paused. You have a choice right now. You can get on that boat and run and spend whatever you have left building a smaller and smaller life in places that can't extradite, waiting for the day someone finds you. She looked at him steadily. Or you can turn around and go home, and in the morning you can call the one attorney in this city who can actually help you, and you can cooperate with a federal process that, with correct handling, leaves you with a reduced exposure and possibly your freedom. He stared at her. Why? He said. It came out rough, the voice beneath the smooth voice, the one she had almost never heard. Because sending you to prison doesn't make me safer, she said. And because your suffering was never the point. She held his gaze one final time. Goodbye, Grayson. She turned and walked back down the dock. Behind her, she heard him, after a moment, pick up his bag. She heard his footsteps not on the boat but back along the dock in the other direction. She didn't turn to confirm it. She didn't need to. Cassian was waiting at the dock entrance with his jacket over one arm, and the specific quality of stillness she had come to understand meant he had heard most of it and was giving her the space of his silence as a form of acknowledgement. She walked up to him and stopped. All right, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at her face. She let him look because she had nothing to hide in it and had spent enough time hiding things in her face that not doing it felt like exhaling. The Rice documents are moving, he said. Luca's account has been formally recorded. The federal supersession is processing. My contact says it'll be complete by 6 a.m. He paused. It's done, Evelina. She stood in the salt air and the amber dock light and let those two words find their actual weight. It's done. She had been running on the specific fuel of forward momentum for so long, since Chicago, since the courthouse bathroom, since the cab ride after signing the divorce papers, that the absence of immediate forward motion was itself a kind of sensation, not emptiness, not deflation. Something more like what happens when a building that has been under construction for a long time finally has its scaffolding removed. The shape of the thing, finally, without the infrastructure of its becoming. My mother, she said. Marco has her at the Mandarin, suite on the 22nd floor. He says she asked for chamomile tea and then fell asleep in the chair watching television. Something moved through her chest that was not entirely composed, and she let it move through because she was not performing anymore. Not tonight, not in front of this man. Okay, she said. He handed her his jacket. She put it on. It was warm and heavy and smelled like the evening, the auction, the car, the accumulated hours of everything they had moved through together, and she pulled it around herself and looked at the harbor for a moment. Luca, she said. He'll face a process, Cassian said. His cooperation is documented. The sister's debt is cleared. What happens after the process? I don't know yet. Do you want to know what I think? Yes? She looked at the water. He spent 8 years being loyal and then 3 years being terrified. That's not a simple thing to judge. She paused. I'm not telling you what to do. I know. A pause. But I'm asking what you think. She considered it honestly. I think betrayal that comes from fear rather than character is different from betrayal that comes from who someone actually is. I think you know the difference. I think you'll figure out what that means. She looked at him. And I think that whatever you decide, you should decide it in a month, when tonight isn't the thing your judgment is running on. He was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. She was not used to hearing those words from him without qualifications. She noted it. They walked back along the dock, and the night air moved around them, and the boats shifted in their slips, and the city held its ambient noise around the silence they were moving through. At the end of the dock, Ortega had the car. The city was beginning to shift, that quality Miami had in the last hour before dawn, when the deep night gave way to something that wasn't yet light, but had stopped being fully dark, a gray suggestion at the eastern edge of the sky above the water. She stopped walking. Cassian stopped beside her. She looked at the water, at the gray edge of the sky, at the reflection of the dock lights moving in the harbor's slow, indifferent surface. She thought about a woman who had signed her name on a piece of paper 19 months ago and gotten into a cab and let herself feel, for the length of a cab ride, the full weight of everything she had lost. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't. She thought about the apartment in Chicago, the boxing gym, the corner store groceries, the first night she had slept deeply in 2 years. She thought about a freezing street and a wounded stranger and a hand pressed against a wound and the instinct that had moved her before her mind could argue against it. She thought about all the ways she had been reduced and all the ways she had refused reduction and all the ways those two things had happened simultaneously, often in the same rooms, often at the hands of the same people. She thought about what remained. The ring on her left hand caught the dock light when she moved. Black diamond, rare and unyielding. She looked at it for a moment. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said. Cassian waited. "Vivian," she said, "the reporter. I made that call in the car while you were watching the hotel entrance, without telling you." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I heard you make it," he said, "through the car audio." She processed this. "And you said nothing." "It was a good call," he said. "You didn't need my permission and you didn't need my confirmation. You needed the space to make it." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very careful answer." "It's an honest one." She held his gaze. "There are going to be more of those. Moments where I move without telling you. Not against you, never against you, but on my own judgment." "Yes," he said. "No qualification, no hesitation. You're all right with that." "I need you to be yourself," he said. "I knew who you were before I asked you to come back here. All of you, including the parts that don't wait for my signal." He paused. "If I had wanted someone who deferred, I would have married someone who deferred." She held his gaze for another moment, and then she turned back to the water because she needed to look at something that wasn't his face while she absorbed what he had just said, and what it cost him to say it, and what it meant for the shape of what they were. The sky was definitely lighter now. Not day yet, not night anymore. That specific, honest threshold. "1 year from now," she said. "Yes? I want to be sitting somewhere that isn't Miami. Not because I'm running, I'm done running, but because I want to choose somewhere." She paused. "I want there to be a somewhere that we chose instead of a somewhere we ended up." He was quiet for a moment. "Where?" She thought about it. She had not thought about it before. Had been so occupied with the work of the past 6 months that the future had been a functional abstraction rather than an actual place. She let herself think about it now. A real place, with real light, with water that wasn't Miami's harbor, and air that wasn't Miami's humid salt weight. "The Ligurian coast," she said, "somewhere small, with stairs and a decent kitchen and a view of the water." "I have a house there," he said. She looked at him. "Near Camogli," he said. "On a cliff. It has stairs." A pause. "The kitchen is adequate." She stared at him for another moment, and then, for the first time in what felt like the entire length of the evening, she laughed. It was a real laugh, short, genuine, surprised out of her. And she could feel the specific tension of the night releasing through it, the accumulated weight of hours of calculation and confrontation, and fear and control letting go through that one unrehearsed sound. "Of course you have a house there," she said. "I have houses in several places," he said. Not boasting, stating. "We're going to have a very long conversation about that." "Yes," he said. "I know." She looked at the water one more time. 19 months ago, she had signed her name on a piece of paper and lost the version of herself that believed love was enough to make a man see her clearly. She had spent 6 months building something new in the ruins of that belief. Not a replacement for it, not a harder or more defended version, but something more accurate. something that understood the difference between being chosen and being convenient, between being seen and being managed, between the love that makes you smaller and the love that finds you exactly where you are and stays there without requiring you to move. She had walked back into Miami wearing a ring and standing next to a man who scared everyone in the room, and she had done it with open eyes, knowing what it cost, knowing what it required, knowing that the price of a life built on honest terms rather than performed ones was that the honesty had to be total, including the honesty about the darkness in the man beside her, the darkness in the world they moved through, the darkness in herself that she had finally stopped pretending wasn't there. She was not a good woman in the simple, uncomplicated sense she had once aspired to. She had leveraged Vivian's fear to build a weapon out of a person. She had stood in a hotel room and delivered a calculated dismantling with her mother sitting 10 feet away. She had chosen, actively, with full information, to build her life next to a man whose work left marks that could not always be explained in courtrooms. She had made those choices. They were hers. She did not disown them. What she knew, what 6 months of boxing gyms and Chicago winters and one frozen street and everything that had followed had taught her, was that the choice to see yourself clearly was the only one that could not be taken from you. You could lose your name, your address, your social calendar, your marriage, your careful sense of yourself as a person who would never be involved in rooms like the one she had walked through tonight. You could lose all of that. And what remained, if you had done the work, was something that nobody else had built and nobody else could dismantle. Herself, on her own terms. She turned from the water. "Let's go get my mother," she said. Her mother was awake when they arrived at the Mandarin, sitting up in the large bed with the television on low and a half-finished cup of tea on the nightstand. The room was high and quiet, and the city spread out beyond the windows in its full dawn illumination, pink-gray light beginning to wash the eastern sky, the harbor below turning from black to deep blue, the first suggestion of the sun still hidden behind the horizon, but announced by the changing quality of everything above it. Her mother looked up when Evelina came in. "There you are," she said. "Here I am," she said. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her mother looked past her to Cassian, who had come in quietly and stood near the window with his hands at his sides, and his face doing something she had not seen it do before. Not composure, not the controlled neutral of a man managing a situation, but the slightly uncertain expression of someone who is in a domestic space and is not entirely sure of the rules. "This is Cassian," Evelina said. Her mother studied him, the clear-eyed, unclouded study of someone whose social filters had simplified down to the essentials. "You're very serious-looking," her mother said. Cassian looked at Evelina. She kept her face perfectly straight. "I've been told," he said. "Come sit down," her mother said. "You're making the room nervous." He came and sat in the chair by the bed, and her mother looked at him for another long moment, and then looked at the ring on Evelina's hand, and then looked at Evelina's face with the specific penetrating attention that sometimes came through everything else, like a compass finding north. "Are you happy?" her mother said. The directness of it, that simple, devastating question, landed in the quiet room with the weight of everything it carried. All the years of being asked different versions of it and giving carefully managed answers. All the years of performing an answer rather than knowing one. She thought about the boxing gym, the Chicago apartment, the frozen street, the courthouse bathroom mirror. Tonight, the dock, the hotel room, the laugh surprised out of her in the salt air. She thought about what happy actually meant when you stripped away the performance of it. Whether it was an absence of difficulty or whether it was something else, something more complicated and more durable, something that existed not in spite of the difficulty, but somehow woven through it, the specific quality of a life that was being lived on accurate terms. "Yes," she said. She meant it. Her mother nodded, satisfied, the way people who have lived long enough to distinguish performance from truth register the difference. "Good," her mother said. She patted Evelina's hand. "Then everything else is details." Outside, the sun came over the horizon. Not dramatically. No burst of light, no sudden transformation. Just the slow, irresistible process of the sky deciding it was done being dark. Pink dissolving into gold. Gold softening into the particular clear blue of a Miami morning in the brief period before the heat reasserted itself. The harbor below going from deep blue to silver to the flat, working brightness of day. Evelina sat on the edge of the bed and held her mother's hand and looked at the light coming through the window and let it be simple for a moment. The way things sometimes can be, on the other side of the worst of them. Not resolved into ease. Nothing in her life was going to be easy. She understood that, had understood it since Chicago, and had chosen it anyway, but simplified by survival into something that could be held. She had come back to Miami to be seen, to walk back into the room where she had been dismissed and let everyone understand what they had actually dismissed. She had wanted the return to be a statement, a reclamation, an answer to everything that had been said about her in her absence. She had gotten all of that, and it had cost things. Luca's 8 years of hidden fracture, Cassian's careful composure in the kitchen after the confession, her own mother in a hotel room not understanding where she was. It had cost things that she would spend a long time accounting for honestly, without the clean narrative that made difficulty into triumph. It was not a triumph. It was something more ordinary and more hard-won than that. It was just her life, finally on the terms she had chosen, with a man who was not simple and a world that was not safe, and a set of choices she intended to keep making with open eyes. Behind her, she heard Cassian shift in the chair. She heard him say something quiet to her mother. She didn't catch the words. And she heard her mother laugh, a real laugh, the way her mother used to laugh before the confusion had moved in, and the sound of it opened something in her chest that she had not known was still closed. She looked at the water. The city moved below her, the city that had watched her suffer and had been wrong about what it was watching. The city that had looked at a woman leaving a marriage and had seen wreckage, and had not understood that wreckage and clearing were the same process. She thought about this balcony of Rice's imagined future that she had forestalled. She thought about the dock and Grayson's back moving away from her down the boards. She thought about 6 words on a phone screen and how fast the world had rearranged itself around them, and how she had rearranged herself inside that world, not without cost, not without compromise, not without the specific and permanent marks that a night like this leaves on a person who has moved through it honestly. She would carry tonight. She knew that, not as weight to be managed, but as fact to be known. The way you carry the shape of your own decisions after they've fully landed, the way you carry the knowledge of what you're capable of, the full, complicated inventory of that. She was capable of a great many things. She was still learning the exact list. 1 year from now, she thought, she would be sitting on a cliff in Liguria with stairs and a view of the water and a kitchen that was apparently adequate. She would be herself, this version, this hard-won, clear-eyed, permanently changed version. And the city below her would be Italian, and the light would be different, and the man who built his life in the space between power and silence would be somewhere in the same house. That was enough. Not everything. Enough. She turned from the window. Her mother had fallen back asleep, the cup of tea cooling on the nightstand. Cassian looked up when she turned, and she met his eyes across the quiet room, across the sleeping presence of her mother and the spreading Miami dawn and the accumulated weight of the entire night. And what passed between them in that look was not a conversation. It was simpler and more complete than that. Recognition. The specific, unperformed recognition of 2 people who have moved through something real together and have arrived on the other side of it, still facing each other. She walked to the window where he was sitting. She stood beside him and looked at the city below. "She said you were making the room nervous," Evelina said. "I was," he said. "You're afraid of her." A pause. "Somewhat." "Good," she said. "That's the right amount." He almost smiled. She had learned over 6 months to read the compression at the corner of his mouth, the fraction of warmth that reached the gray eyes before he reined it back. She had learned it the way you learn a language, gradually and then completely, until the day you realize you're thinking in it without effort. Below them, Miami went on being Miami. Relentless and salt-bright and full of people making decisions that would matter and decisions that wouldn't, in the specific morning quality of a city that had not slept cleanly and was beginning again anyway. She had made her decisions. They were hers. She put her hand against the window glass and felt the warmth of the coming day already stored in it. And she looked at the city that had once watched her shrink and had now run out of room to hold the version of her that remained. And she let herself be, for one quiet moment in a high room above the water, exactly who she was. No less, not any more.